Daniel had always been a hard worker. Every morning, he woke up before sunrise, got ready in a rush, and took the same crowded bus to his job. He worked at a small warehouse, moving boxes all day, sometimes even working extra shifts just to make ends meet. But no matter how hard he worked, it never seemed to be enough. His paycheck barely covered his rent, food, and bills. Every month, he had to decide what to pay first and what to delay. Late fees kept piling up. His landlord had already warned him twice that if he missed another payment, he would be evicted. Daniel had no safety net. No family to help him, no savings to fall back on. He had tried picking up extra gigs after work, but exhaustion always caught up with him. He was running on fumes, both physically and emotionally. One night, as he sat in his small apartment, staring at a pile of unpaid bills, he felt completely defeated. His rent was overdue again, and payday was still a week away. He had no idea how he was going to come up with the money in time. Lately, he had started considering desperate options. Maybe taking out a risky loan, maybe selling the few things he had, maybe sleeping in his car if he lost his apartment. He sighed and rubbed his face, feeling the weight of his problems crushing him. He wanted a way out, but there was none in sight. Little did he know, something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would change his life in ways he never imagined. A few days later, Daniel came home from work feeling exhausted. His body ached from lifting heavy boxes all day, and his mind was clouded with worry. He had just a couple of days left to pay his overdue rent before the landlord would start the eviction process. As he unlocked his mailbox, his heart pounded. He expected another overdue notice, another warning, maybe even a final notice telling him to leave. But when he pulled out an envelope from his landlord's office, something felt different. The paper inside was short and to the point. His rent had been paid in full. Daniel froze. His eyes scanned the letter over and over again, but the message stayed the same. Someone had covered his rent. But there was no name, no explanation, just a confirmation that he no longer owed anything for this month. For a moment he thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the landlord mixed up accounts, maybe another tenant's payment got credited to him. He rushed to his landlord's office, letter in hand. The landlord, an older man with a stern face, barely looked up when Daniel walked in. "Hey, I got this notice about my rent being paid," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is this a mistake?" The landlord glanced at the letter and shook his head. "No mistake. It's covered." Daniel frowned. "By who?" The landlord shrugged. "Can't say. Just take it as good news." That answer didn't sit right with Daniel, but he had no choice but to accept it. He walked out of the office in a daze. His rent was paid. He wasn't getting evicted. But who had done this for him? That night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Relief mixed with confusion. He wanted to be grateful, but without knowing who to thank, it felt strange. Was it a friend? A stranger? Someone at work? He had no idea. All he knew was that his life had just taken an unexpected turn. For the first time in months, Daniel felt like he could breathe. His rent was covered, at least for now. That meant he wouldn't have to scrape together money at the last second, or skip meals, just to keep a roof over his head. At work, he felt lighter. The constant stress that had been weighing him down seemed to ease, even if just a little. He focused better, moved quicker, and even managed a few conversations with his coworkers, instead of staying lost in his worries. Without the pressure of rent hanging over him, he could finally catch up on other bills. He bought a few extra groceries instead of stretching out what little food he had left. It wasn't a luxury, but it felt like a break. Still, the mystery nagged at him. Who had paid his rent? Every time he tried to think of an answer, he hit a dead end. His friends weren't in a position to help. He had no family members who would secretly do something like this. And his coworkers, well, most of them were struggling just like he was. Daniel asked around casually. "You ever heard of a landlord just letting someone's rent slide?" One of his coworkers laughed. "Not a chance. If anything, they're quick to raise it." Another chimed in. "Maybe you've got a secret admirer." Daniel shook his head. That didn't seem likely either. Days passed, and the confusion only grew. Every time he looked at his apartment door, a part of him felt uneasy. Was someone watching out for him? And if so, why? He told himself to stop worrying about it. The important thing was that he was safe, for now. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. A month passed, and Daniel slowly adjusted to his temporary relief. He still didn't know who had paid his rent, but he told himself to move on. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a one-time thing. But then, something strange happened. When the next month's rent was due, Daniel braced himself for the usual stress. He had managed to save a little, but not enough to cover the full amount. He expected to be in trouble again. Instead, another letter arrived. Just like before, it said his rent had been paid in full. No name, no explanation. Just a confirmation that he owed nothing. Daniel's hands shook as he read it. Once could have been luck. Twice? That wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. Someone was looking out for him. His heart pounded as he rushed back to the landlord's office. This time, he wasn't going to leave without answers. "You need to tell me who's doing this," he demanded. The landlord barely looked up from his paperwork. "I already told you, I can't say." Daniel's frustration grew. "Why not? It's my rent, isn't it?" The landlord sighed and finally met his eyes. "Look, all I can tell you is that it's taken care of. You're not in trouble, so take the help and move on." But Daniel couldn't just move on. Over the next few weeks, he paid more attention to everything around him. He started watching the mail carefully, checking if there were any signs of who was behind the payments. He asked his coworkers again, this time with more urgency, but no one knew anything. Then, something else caught his attention. Whenever he left work late, he noticed a familiar black car parked near the warehouse. It was sleek, expensive, way too nice for this neighborhood. At first he thought it was random, but then he realized it was always there on payday. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Could this be connected? He didn't have proof yet, but he was determined to find out. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The mystery payments, the black car near his workplace, the landlord's refusal to talk, it all felt connected. But how? One evening, as he left work later than usual, he noticed the car again. This time, it wasn't just parked, it was occupied. The headlights were off, but he could see someone sitting inside. His heart pounded. He walked past it slowly, pretending not to notice, but out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of a well-dressed man in the driver's seat. The guy wasn't looking at him, but something about him felt important. Daniel didn't know any rich people. At least, not personally. So why was this car here? And why did it always show up on payday? The next day, he kept his eyes open for more clues. At lunchtime, he overheard his landlord talking to someone outside the building. Daniel couldn't make out the whole conversation, but he caught one key phrase. "Don't worry, the payments are being handled." His pulse quickened. Who was handling them? The landlord's tone was different this time, more careful, almost respectful. That made Daniel even more suspicious. He decided to wait outside the building just to see who the landlord had been speaking to. A few minutes later, a man walked out. He wasn't just anyone, he was someone Daniel recognized. His stomach dropped. It was his billionaire boss. The same man who owned the warehouse where Daniel worked. The same man who rarely spoke to employees. The same man Daniel assumed had no idea he even existed. But somehow, this man had not only noticed him, he had been secretly paying his rent. Daniel took a step back, his mind spinning. Why? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do now? Daniel stood frozen as he watched his billionaire boss walk away. He had always assumed the man didn't even know his name. Yet somehow, he had been the one secretly paying Daniel's rent. His mind raced with questions. Why would someone so powerful care about his struggles? Why would he go out of his way to help? Daniel thought back to the few times he had seen his boss up close. The man always carried himself with quiet confidence, dressed in expensive suits, and spoke in a calm, controlled voice. He rarely interacted with the workers except for brief company-wide speeches. And yet, here he was, helping, in secret. Daniel needed to know why. The next morning he couldn't focus at work. He kept stealing glances at his boss's office on the second floor. The man was there, as usual, going about his business like nothing had happened. By the end of the day, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He had to confront him. He waited near the exit until he saw the billionaire heading toward the parking lot. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to step forward. "Sir?" His voice was hesitant but firm. His boss stopped and turned, his sharp eyes studying Daniel. For the first time, They weren't just looking through him, they were looking at him. Yes? Daniel swallowed hard. I know what you did. A flicker of surprise crossed the billionaire's face, but he didn't deny it. He didn't even look guilty. Instead, he sighed, as if he had expected this moment to come. You weren't supposed to find out, he said quietly. Daniel stared. Why? Why are you helping me? For a moment the man said nothing. Then in a calm voice, he said something that Daniel never expected. Because once, I was just like you. Daniel's breath caught. What did that mean? Before he could ask, his boss did something even more unexpected. He smiled. Walk with me, he said. Let me tell you a story. Daniel hesitated, then followed. His life was about to change forever. Daniel walked beside his boss, his heart still racing. He had never spoken to the man before, not like this. Now, he was about to hear something that could explain everything. The billionaire glanced at him, then spoke in a calm voice. Years ago, before I built this company, I was struggling. I worked long hours at a job that barely paid my bills. I lived paycheck to paycheck. Some months I didn't know if I'd make rent. Daniel's eyes widened. He had been in the same position? My boss at the time saw my struggles, the billionaire continued. He never said anything directly, but one day, I noticed my rent had been paid. Just like you did. Daniel listened, barely breathing. I never knew who did it, until years later. By then I had built something of my own. I had power, wealth, but I never forgot what it felt like to struggle. He paused. So I made a promise. If I ever saw someone working as hard as I had, I'd do the same for them. Daniel's chest tightened. But why in secret? His boss gave a small smile. Because I didn't want gratitude. I just wanted to give someone the same chance I got. Silence stretched between them. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had spent so long fighting to survive, never expecting kindness like this. I don't know what to say, he admitted. You don't have to say anything, his boss replied. Just promise me one thing. Daniel nodded. When you're in a position to help someone one day, pass it on. Daniel swallowed hard. He knew, without a doubt, he would.